Japan, a country shrouded in mystery in the Far East, cradle of ingenious management strategies, imbued by the spirits of the samurai, inspired by a mystic spirituality. Or is that merely our romanticized view of a foreign culture? We'll talk about that today. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and I welcome you to another Soft Skill talk. Things from foreign countries seem, well, foreign and exotic and shrouded in mystery, and advertising obviously likes to pick that up and push it forward. I had an example of that recently when I did the book review of Marie Kondo's The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying. I have the UK edition here. It has the subtitle A Japanese Art, and the cover has, you might be able to see it, a typical, what is supposedly a typical Japanese pattern. So here we have a typical example of something being presented as uniquely Japanese. And yeah, this occurs frequently, of course. I think Japan is a good example for this phenomenon because Japan is quite present, especially in pop culture. I think everybody has some view of Japan, some associations, some ideas. So I think it's a good example. So today we will talk about some Japanese topics that might not be as romantic or as uniquely Japanese as we thought. There are plenty of examples for that. So this video won't be endlessly long. I will limit myself. I will focus on two. First is the samurai, which is especially a good example for this topic. And the other is management methods, which are especially related to our usual soft skill topics. And one thing I won't talk about much is pop culture. Except, of course, for the fact that samurai are quite present in pop culture as well, so I guess that counts. And I think we all have an image of what the typical samurai is like. A great warrior with excellent swordsmanship and a strict code of honor, and he is pretty much also a philosopher and also a monk. He meditates, he looks at the cherry blossoms and whatnot. So what is the historic reality here? The year 1600 is quite important in that regard, and the Battle of Sekigahara that took place in that year. Now, 1600 isn't that early. The Middle Ages in Europe were about 600 to 1500, so 1600 is somewhat late. This is also the time when there already were firearms, so it's not the typical image of the sword-wielding or bow-using samurai we might have in mind. The time before 1600 had plenty of big battles of fighting, but there wasn't this image of the samurai yet that we know and love. The end of that period, late 1500s to the late 1500s, there was a time in Japan called the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the warring states, where all the feudal lords fought amongst themselves and tried to conquer more territory and so on. And so there was pretty much civil war for more than 100 years. And at the end of that time, three great warlords emerged who conquered large territories. You might have heard their names before. The first was Oda Nobunaga. He conquered a lot of land, and after he died, Toyotomi Hideyoshi took over, and he further expanded the realm. And after his death, finally Tokugawa Ieyasu became the ruler. And this is where Sekigahara comes in. 1600, in the Battle of Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu defeated his last big rival, and he united Japan under his leadership. And after that, there pretty much was peace. There were 250 years of Tokugawa rule. The Tokugawa clan, the Tokugawa shogunate, ruled for 250 years. And in that time there was, of course, there were some struggles, but there were no major wars. So this whole business of samurai fighting in great big battles, that was over. However, all the stuff we know samurai for, like their code of honor and things like that, all of that was developed in this time, in the Tokugawa age, in the so-called Edo period. For example, the Hagakure, the code of honor of the samurai, that was written 1710 to 1716 by a samurai called Tsunetomo Yamamoto. This was 100 years after the Battle of Sekigahara. Or Miyamoto Musashi, probably the most well-known, the most famous samurai of all times. He was born 1584, and as a 16-year-old boy he fought in the Battle of Sekigahara, and his great, let's call it career, that took off after Sekigahara. So it also took place in this era of peace. And finally, Bushido, literally the way of the warrior, that you've probably heard of before, that is also about code of honor and proper samurai behavior and samurai spirit and whatnot. This term, Bushido, it became famous and well known due to a book by one Inazo Nitobe, and that was published in 1900. After the age of samurai was over, after samurai were gone for good. So he wrote this book based on the stories and the things that were that each generation told each other, but of course also it was based on his own ideas of how it probably was back then. So even in Japan itself, we have a kind of a romanticized view of this age of the samurai. And this has been problematic in the Second World War, when this samurai ideology and Bushido and all those ideas were used for the imperialistic propaganda. For example, the kamikaze pilots who steered their planes onto enemy battleships and died fighting, sacrificed themselves to do some damage to enemy ships. This Bushido propaganda was used a lot on them, and there were lots of references to the past, to the samurai times. The term kamikaze itself is a reference to the past. When the Mongol realm, after conquering China, tried to invade Japan, they sent a large fleet, and they had an army that was so big that Japan probably wouldn't have stood a chance. But those great fleet came into a storm, and this storm destroyed a large part of that fleet, and this secured Japan's victory over the invaders. And this storm, that was called the kamikaze, the wind of the gods. Kami is gods and kaze is wind, and this is where that term comes from. So this is not that innocent. It has been quite problematic in that time. So, conclusion, a lot of what we know about samurai is stuff that was to some degree made up in retrospect. It is not all based on historical evidence. And as far as historical evidence goes, we have to understand that the time of warriors fighting in big battles and the time of codes of honor and whatnot, that those were two different periods. Now, it's of course way worse for the ninja, the silent assassins of Japan. There we have very, very little historical evidence, and pretty much all about them is made up and is from pop culture. Another topic that is relevant in this area is Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is a school of Buddhism that originated in China and then via Vietnam and Korea came to Japan, and of course from Japan it came to the West. Zen Buddhism is related to martial arts in China because of the Shaolin monasteries, and in Japan there also were warrior monks and also a samurai dealt with Zen Buddhism, very interested in Zen Buddhism, so it fits into this whole samurai business. And furthermore, of course, Zen Buddhism is something that has some vague popularity in the West. It's not like people in the West would actually become Zen monks, or at least they rarely do so, but they like to toy with ideas or quotes or whatnot from Buddhism, and of course this is also heavily romanticized and often has a limited relation to the original Buddhism. We have the recent trend of meditation. Meditation has been quite popular in recent years. We have a mindfulness that is based to a large degree on Buddhist teachings, and we recently discussed nonviolent communication by Marshall Rosenberg, and Rosenberg as well has been influenced by Buddhist ideas. Now, of course, it's fine to take inspiration from Buddhism, but we shouldn't expect any of that to really represent the original religion. Now, this image we have of the samurai and the samurai spirit and Buddhism and whatnot, of course, this has the influence on our image of the Japanese spirit, the Japanese being. And there is one further element I'd like to mention briefly, and that is Ruth Benedict. You might not know her. She was an anthropologist and ethnologist. She studied Japan. She got a commission from the US Office of War Information near the end of the Second World War to write a study about Japanese culture and Japanese spirit as a guide for the occupational forces to better understand and get along with Japanese society. Later, this study was also published as a book in 1946. The title is The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And this book strongly influenced the Western image, the Western understanding of Japan. However, the book isn't that flawless. One problem is that obviously during the Second World War, Ruth Benedict wasn't able to just travel to Japan and learn about the Japanese spirit in the actual country, but she had to rely on secondary sources. She talked to prisoners of war and to immigrants, but it was all kind of secondhand knowledge. And furthermore, by now the book is quite old, from the 40s, and people had strange ideas back then. For example, Ruth Benedict distinguished between shame cultures and guilt cultures. A shame culture, and she also counted Japan among the shame cultures. A shame culture is if your behavior, if negative behavior is sanctioned by outward reactions. If you say, oh, I better not do this, people will dislike it, I will lose face in front of other people, I have to be ashamed in front of other people if I do that. And in a guilt culture, this critical perception is kind of internalized. In a guilt culture, we say, I should better not do this, otherwise I will later feel guilty, I will be ashamed before myself. And I don't know if those ideas are even in use anymore today, but at least they are quite controversial. So, this book probably wouldn't stand a modern critical check. Oh, one concept I'd like to mention briefly here is Ikigai, which is a rather modern idea. Ikigai in itself is a Japanese word, and it literally means something like something worth living for. And as I understand it, it is just a plain normal word that is similar to the English word purpose. And as I understand it, Japan, just as other countries, also has a trend where people ask themselves, what do I really want to do with my life? What do I really want? What is my purpose? And yeah, Japan has this as well. It is similar to what we have in the West, for example, in regard to John Strzelecki, who's also about what do I really want in my life. So, nothing unusual. However, this word ikigai in the West, it's usually presented as some uniquely Japanese philosophy with a cloud of fascinating ideas around it that, to my understanding, doesn't really exist in Japan itself. So, what do the Japanese do with that exciting Japanese spirit? For example, after the Second World War, they were able to perform an economic rise to power that was quite impressive. In the 60s and 70s, Japan dominated the world market for cars, for electronics. Japan became quite strong economically in a short time after this big defeat in the Second World War, and that was of course quite impressive. So all over the world people asked, how did they do it? How were they able to have this economic growth? And the explanation seemed to be some uniquely Japanese secret, some Japanese mindset, Japanese philosophy that was incorporated into their production and management strategies. And from that, there came Japanese methods like the famous Toyota method. Toyota managed to build up a quite efficient production where they used very little means, little resources to successfully produce their cars, and they continuously improved their processes, and this allowed them to be quite successful on the world market. And later, from the Toyota method, other methods emerged: lean production, lean management, and the agile methods that are so popular today in the business world, they also have roots that go back to lean production, lean management, and to the Toyota method. Now, the reality isn't quite that exciting. Now, obviously, after the Second World War, among others, management consultants and the like came to Japan to sell their services there. And there is one person especially important among those, and that is William Edwards Deming and his mentor Walter Andrew Shewhart. You might have heard the name Deming before. Deming is the guy with the PDCA cycle, Plan, Do, Check, Act, a model for evolutionary continuous improvement. Deming was from quality management. That was his profession. And in this role, he was invited to Japan by General MacArthur, the leader of the occupational forces, in 1950, because they had problems with radios they produced locally and that didn't meet necessary quality standards. So they invited Deming so he could teach them about quality management. And he held speeches in front of important leaders from different industries. And yeah, you know what the usual etiquette is in such a situation. You clap and you say, "Oh yeah, great idea," and then you continue just as you did before. However, the Japanese didn't know that. They actually implemented all this stuff. They implemented Deming's ideas and continued them and built further ideas upon them and created things like the Toyota method out of those teachings. And they became quite successful doing that. And the consumer product industries in America and in Europe were pretty much defeated by the Japanese one. And everybody wondered, how did the Japanese do that? And so they looked and they said, "Wow, look what the Japanese do. What fascinating, great ideas." Now, in the West, Deming's ideas were pretty much forgotten, by the way. So you see the irony of that situation. So this Japanese economic success and their great management strategies, Toyota method and whatnot, this was all quite pragmatic. This was pretty much based on the Japanese actually implementing and following through with those ideas and strategies that people like Deming presented to them. And it was nothing mystic, spiritual or whatnot. Now, this whole topic is still heavily romanticized, especially terms like Kaizen. Kaizen is just a normal Japanese word and it means improvement. And of course it is relevant because continuous improvement plays an important role in things like the Toyota method. However, for the Japanese, as I understand it, Kaizen is still merely just a plain normal word and there is no big philosophy or whatnot around it, even though this is the way it is usually presented in the West. Now, this doesn't mean that there are no cultural differences or that there are no things uniquely Japanese. Of course there are, just not as many as we tend to believe. Let me give you one example for a cultural difference. This is quite interesting because it concerns intercultural communication. It's called Aisuchi. Aisuchi is something that is specific to the Japanese language and it refers to what the person does who is currently listening. Now, in the West, if you listen, you often just sit there and do nothing and yeah, you listen. without reacting in any way. However, if Japanese people talk, the person who is listening will permanently give feedback, like, oh, yeah, oh, so that's how it is. Oh, yes, yeah, I see, I understand. So the person listening will permanently give feedback. And this is an interesting phenomenon because it often leads to misunderstandings. For example, imagine a situation where an American businessman talks to a Japanese businessman. First, the American businessman speaks and he notices these reactions from his Japanese counterpart. Oh, yes, yes, oh, yes. And he thinks, oh, great, he agrees to everything. He's fine with everything. But this isn't actually the case. What the Japanese person actually means is, yes, I understand, yes, I listen to you, yes, I follow. There is no agreement there. And then the Japanese person talks. And the American businessman does what he usually does. And this totally confuses the Japanese person because they think, what's up with them? Do they not understand me? Do they not comprehend what I say? Are they not even listening to me? Because they are used to this permanent feedback. So, of course, there are cultural differences and there are things uniquely Japanese, just not as many as we tend to think. What are your associations with Japan? What are the things that come to your mind if you think about Japan? Maybe some of you have even been there and experienced it firsthand. Let me know about your observations in the comments. By the way, did you know that Zen monks always click the like button and subscribe to the channel? And you know how healthy they are and how long they live. Just saying. We will see each other again next week. For today I take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.